Now, continuing to work towards absolute workability of power processing, and there still being pre-clears who did not run it so easily or so well, John McMasters was led to now look for what else could be interfering with getting smoothly the results of the conditions process, which is what this is all about. And the next thing that was found was that pre-clears could have bypass charge on their auditing, and that this would get in the way. So, just as earlier practices could get in the way, and that was handled with what condition have you encountered in witchcraft or whatever, there was a process developed to handle whatever bypass charge was getting in the way from auditing. So the commands for this were, what question have you encountered in Scientology, or in auditing, or Dianetics? You would ask the pre-clear what these different wordings and see what got the biggest read, or what they felt was the best word to use from their viewpoint anyway. And so then the question would be something like, what condition have you encountered in auditing, and how have you handled it? And whatever bypass charge occurred in auditing would be rooted out the same way using the basic principles of Power Process 6. There'd be a revivification, and all the charge relating to auditing that was getting in the way would be resolved. So just to keep score now, these are 5 processes that are all called Power Process, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but actually there's a total of 6, because more research was done, and now one more possible reason why a pre-clear might be not be running power well was found and looked into. And on this one, we're talking about committing harmful acts, what we call overts. And so, working in backwards sequence now, we have Power Process 1. And the commands for this are, what overt have you committed? And then, what problem were you trying to solve? And by the way, this is a brilliant application, and I've used this on that same application on a process I've developed based on these principles, which has worked brilliantly. And it's the principle that a person commits a harmful act in order to solve a problem. And if you run out not just the harmful act, but the problem they were trying to solve, you bring about change, you bring about resolution. So in Power Process 1, we're talking about overts and withholds. So the commands are, what overt have you committed? What problem were you trying to solve? What haven't you said? What problem were you trying to solve? Alternate repetitive. So that became Power Process 1. And to summarize and understand the numbering of the power processes, see, at the end of this, what you want to do is to be able to successfully run the conditions process, the original power process, the core power process that produces the most fabulous change of running out the incident and condition that is most dominant on the PC's consciousness. So now you've got Power Process 6 became the designation of the original and core power process, because everything else would be run prior to successfully running Power Process 6. So initially, in ordinary sequence as the Church of Scientology practices it, somebody put on power processing is going to start with Power Process 4, the source process. Tell me a source, tell me about it. Tell me a no source, tell me about it. Then they're going to run Power Process 5, the existence process. What is, what isn't. And then they're considered fully prepared to run Power Process 6, the original core power process. Tell me an existing condition, tell me how you've handled it. And as I'd said, on the existence process, if the pre-clear is answering with dichotomies to the questions what is, what isn't, hot, cold, up, down, everything, nothing, whatever answers they give that are dichotomies. That's when you'll shift over to what condition have you encountered in witchcraft or whatever earlier practice, and how have you handled it. Now that became numbered power process 2. And of course, that's a conditional process. Not the conditions process, different meaning. A conditional process to be run if dichotomies are run into in running the existence process. And the number 3, power process 3, is the one that's used when there's bypass charge on previous auditing getting in the way. What condition have you encountered in auditing? How have you handled it? And power process 1 was the designation given to the overts and withholds. What overt have you committed? What problem were you trying to solve? What haven't you said? What problem were you trying to solve? Okay, and there you have the basic, as the church developed them, power processes. Now, there have been further developments of power processing that I was involved in with a colleague who was present at St. Hill when these processes were being developed. And to make this understood, what one needs to understand is the nature of charge. So when we talk about the nature of charge as we understand it, we're going to talk a little bit about what in Scientology is called goals, problems, masses. So, all bypass charge, and by bypass charge, we mean restimulated, in restimulation, and being experienced and dramatized, and not yet resolved charge, has its foundation in earlier incidents, which in turn spring from what we call goals, problems, masses, which are packages of opposing identities and all the opposing forces and behavioral patterns these generate. Ron Hubbard's definition of the term case is the whole sum of bypass charge. So again, with these GPMs, what we're talking about is opposing forces, opposing ideas. Two things that create an impasse by running directly at each other. So what we want to do here, the goal of thoroughly resolving any conceivable bypass charge, is achieved through rooting out these underlying goals, problems, masses, the efforts and counter-efforts, and the identities and whatever else is involved. So this establishes that the approach to addressing this charge should include commands that prompt the running of dichotomies, or opposing viewpoints and forces, and encompass all viewpoints and flows, so as to leave nothing unviewed, unresolved, or subject to restimulation. So this is how we make power processing more effective. What we can do is, first of all, you can take any condition that a pre-clear is experiencing. This is another thing we develop. You can take any condition that a pre-clear is experiencing that is chronic and needs to be addressed, and that they're presenting as what's on their mind and dominating them, using power processing very specifically. Just as with power process 3, we specifically address bypass charge related to what was experienced in auditing, or power process 2. We direct power processing to conditions encountered in an earlier practice with the command, what condition have you encountered in, and then you name the earlier practice. Well, you can do this with whatever conditions a pre-clear is experiencing. But to start off with the basic idea, keep it a little simple for you, is if you take the original commands of the core power process, tell me an existing condition, tell me how you've handled it, and you wanted to make this a little more effective, well, then you would run it by adding a set of commands to make it dichotomies. Tell me an existing condition that is being experienced, and tell me how you've handled it, and then tell me an existing condition that is being caused, and tell me how you've handled it. Now that's taking advantage of one of the prime dichotomies, cause and effect, which I like to use a lot. Another very prevalent dichotomy that that one can use is must have, can't have. Tell me an existing condition that has to be experienced. Tell me how you've handled it. Tell me an existing condition that can't be experienced, that you can't experience. Tell me how you've handled it. And running that roots it out even better, because now you're adding another level of effort processing or handling GPMs in running must-have versus can't-have, because that in itself is an effort and counter-effort, and it's worked dramatically. But again, you can take any condition that a pre-clear is complaining about, a condition of can't get out of bed in the morning. Okay, so tell me an existing condition of can't get out of bed in the morning. How is that handled? Tell me an existing condition of must get out of bed in the morning. How is that handled? It can give you the same type of incidents. It can give you different aspects of the same incident, but it much more thoroughly and much more effectively runs things out, and this is proven to work very well. So the next thing I want to show is very interesting, is that I have an application of this principle of power processing to use on very effectively running out charge on interiorization. People who have had a lot of processing in the Church of Scientology are very familiar with what we call int rundowns. So to begin with, what are we talking about? What does that mean? Okay, well, let me just read to you what I've already written. Just about anyone who has much experience as a classed auditor or as a pre-clear has experienced or observed the issues of the int rundowns. Okay, now first of all, what we're looking to resolve with int rundowns is charge, discomfort, worry on the subject of being in or out of the body, going in or out of the body. And Ron Hubbard talks about this quite a bit, and it can be very intense, severe charge. In my experience, when someone truly has what we call Out-Int, I've seen pre-clears sit in front of me trembling and or crying. This is very heavy and severe charge when it really is Out-Int. I think a lot of times it gets run when that's really not what it is, which is one issue. But anyway, to continue, the int rundowns generally tended not to be a smooth experience, and more often than not involve a disproportionate amount of correction and redoing. There exists, in fact, something called an end of endless int repair rundown created in recognition of these issues, but it really hasn't fared appreciably better. Pre-clears get exasperated with all the time and money they spent on these without any stable and clear-cut resolution. So the power processing handling approach has thus far resolved the bypass charge dramatically, and with a single session each time, actually just one process, rather than this whole rundown. And I suspect there can be so many different types of incidents involving this area of material that other bank material of interiorization or exteriorization might still be subject to restimulation. But so far it appears that running this power processing technique once has done the job. Nobody's had a recurrence of Out-Int. Okay, so here are some observations regarding why there's room or need for improvement in the pre-existing procedures for resolving bypass charge on interiorization and exteriorization, besides what I've just mentioned. Now, firstly, the most important principle of processing, as I said a bit earlier, is to parallel the individual PC's mind. With these, the auditor, when I say these, I mean the int rundowns that are pre-existing. The auditor doesn't get the item to run from the pre-clear. He doesn't have the pre-clear give him the wording of the charge of going in or the charge of going out or being in or being out. Instead, the auditor takes a pre-packaged, prepared list of what's called int buttons and assesses these with the BPC on the meter. So the auditor sits across from the pre-clear and with the meter observable, go in, went in, pushed in, pulled in, forced in. You get the idea. There's a set of pre-written, what we call int buttons, phrases relating to this charge. Now, none of these phrases are necessarily going to resonate perfectly with the pre-clear. You know, what you work with is whatever gets the biggest read on the meter, whatever shows the most charge by the needle motion. And that's a flawed approach, you know. And plus then, you're supposed to run everything that got a read. And I think that's how you run a pre-clear into the ground. You run items that they never gave you in the first place, and you run more items that they never gave you in the first place. It's not really hard to understand what went wrong with int rundowns. I'm sorry. It's funny, because it's so simple. Okay, we'll get into what's obviously correct, but to continue, the rundown approach strays. And we say rundown, okay. A rundown means you're going to do a whole series of actions. You know, it's big, it's long, it's lengthy. And anytime you hear the word rundown, that's what it means. And this approach of a whole rundown strays from handling the actual incidents that were in restimulation to begin with. And instead it restimulates of the material that the pre-clear had no interest in or no charge restimulated on in the first place. I mean, take situation A. You ask the pre-clear, okay, what phrase says it best for this charge that you feel on the subject of in? Pulled in, pushed in, punched in, anything. I mean, it doesn't matter how ridiculous it sounds coming out of your mouth, you know, just let your file clerk hand it to you. What resonates with you? What says it best? And whatever he says, you just use it. Okay? You're processing the pre-clear. You're not processing an HCOB. I'm sorry. I get a kick of how simple that is and how easily in our training we all accepted this wonderful idea of processing the hell out of the pre-clear instead of processing what needed to be handled. See, when you do this, when you assess a list, you know, it's part of what's wrong with the whole concept or definition that's given of auditing. In some places, like in one of the definitions in the tech dictionary, it says that what auditing is restimulating something in the pre-clear so that you can then run it out. Well, you know, by that very definition, if that's what you're doing something irrelevant. Because if it wasn't restimulated in the pre-clear in the first place, then it doesn't need to be run out, and it's not going to have a big effect for the pre-clear if it wasn't bothering them in the first place. I think it's part of the idea of you're just going to run out all the material in the reactive mind this way, and you're going to keep digging away, and somewhere along the line some of it's going to matter. It's really a flawed approach, and you could spend 10 lifetimes trying to dig out every incident the pre-clear ever experienced, and you would never be done. So that's the error of the rundown approach. You know, the auditor gets a read on go in. Well, he restimulated the pre-clear on something that has to do with go in. But again, that's irrelevant. He didn't walk into that session worried about go in. You're trying to make change for the pre-clear. You want to help them accomplish their goals, resolve what they want to resolve. That's the auditor's job, not to resolve what you think Ron Hubbard wants you to resolve, or what you think you want to resolve, the sessions for the pre-clear. Basics. So, to continue. If the pre-clear actually does have charge in restimulation on interiorization or exteriorization, it is extremely unlikely that multiple chains of incidents relating to those different int buttons are all currently restimulated. In fact, the very idea that this is happening can reasonably be called absurd. When something is in restimulation, it is essentially one item existing in a chain of any number of related incidents of cause and effect from any number of experiential viewpoints, or what we call flows, meaning experiencing what one causes someone else to experience, experiencing what one causes you to experience, experiencing, observing what one person causes another to experience, and at the base of it all, what's called flow zero, causing oneself to experience something. Okay, when such an item is in restimulation, actual interiorization, exteriorization charge, it tends to be very disturbing for the being, and that one item should mercifully be directly addressed and resolved. When this item is resolved, the relief felt is generally dramatic, and there is no doubt that the distress has been resolved. The rundown approach instead drives this over-stimulated pre-clear through multiple chains of incidents other than the item that the being needs relief from, making the auditing rough and bypassing the charge that really matters to the pre-clear. And all this is at the pre-clear's expense. So, I mean, you've got a situation here. I mean, Ron Hubbard said it well in CS Series 60, the worst tangle. When somebody has Out-Int, you don't process them on anything but that specific bypass charge, because you're going to be unsuccessful if you try and address anything else. And when somebody really has Out-Int, okay, and it's just not being run just as a solution because the pre-clear is still not doing well with everything you've done so far, or because of a false read on a CS53 or some other list, or because you've managed to restimulate something by assessing a list. That's not the same thing. When a pre-clear from life or from auditing actually has experienced a restimulation of charge on going in and or out of the body, it's huge. And you know, it's very unfair. It's very uncaring. It's a harmful act to put a PC through running all kinds of other phrases and int buttons and chains that are not addressing what he walked in there, you know, shaking from. Okay, you've got to hit that on the head. That's your job. So all you need to do, it's not complicated. A lot of auditing tech can be so complicated the way it's written. You know, unnecessarily complicated is how I should put it. I've run int rundowns and so forth. And not that I found it hard to understand complicated, but a whole bunch of unnecessary steps complicated. That's the problem. Unnecessary steps. So all you need to do is be there with the pre-clear. Listen to the pre-clear. Accept the pre-clear's information. So how do you do that? Okay, so you found out through one way or another that there is this charge. The pre-clear is clearly very upset, very interbulated. So he says something that gives you a clue about this. You pick it up however you perceive it and you check, do you feel you have charge on going in or out of the body, or being out of the body, or being in the body? And believe me, you don't need to look at an E-meter. If that's there, you know, they're practically going to jump out of the chair when you say it. They're going to acknowledge it so well that it would be an invalidation of the pre-clear to even look at what the meter's doing. So, having gotten that, the next thing you do
ask for the wording.
That's right, you got it. Thank you, Tatiana. You ask for the wording. That's exactly what you do. And here's where you start. This is the successful way that I do this. And I'm not saying that, I will never say about anything that this is the ultimate correct way and it could never be developed better. I will never say that about anything, because that's a stop. Okay? And that's been said too many times, particularly with things like Scientology. It's perfected. Don't mess with it. Terrible. Stops all forward progress. Anyway, so where I begin from is to ask, at this moment, would you say the charge is more on in, or the charge is more on out? Okay, now again, this is not rote. The pre-clear may be saying in which case you're not going to ask the question. It would be invalidative, you know. All of this is done not rotely. All of this is done in, informally, two-way comm. Get the information, that's what's important. And when you have that information in or out, the next thing you do, just as you said, Tatiana, using that answer, ask the pre-clear for his own phrase that best communicates the charge. And you can offer some examples to make this clear. You are looking for a running item. Example, the pre-clear answers in. So you say, okay, just for example, pushed in, knocked in, thrown in, or whatever you get on this, any phrase whatsoever, what says it perfectly for you? What conveys what you're feeling best for you on that in? And whatever they give you, they've just done you the greatest favor in the world, because now you can go right to it and you can save those 16 hours of assessing and running int buttons to little or no good effect. Okay, whatever he says, stomped in, blown in, puffed in, crackled in, I don't care. No matter how ridiculous it might sound to you, or even to the pre-clear, they've just given you the golden key. And so you take that. Having established the running item for one side of the in-out dichotomy, you now ask for the other running item. If they said in, you now ask for the out. If they said out, you now ask for the in. And then you apply what we've been discussing of the core power process, conditions process, only as a dichotomy. Now, this is the easiest thing in the world for the dichotomy to use. It's obvious. If you're running this, the dichotomy is in and out. So the commands go, tell me a condition encountered of, okay, and now whatever the first item they gave you, the in or the out, tell me a condition encountered of slammed in, okay, just as an example. And how is that handled? Okay, and then tell me a condition encountered of forced out, or whatever they gave you for the out, okay? How is that handled? And it's beautiful. That's all you need to do, alternate repetitive. As John McMaster said, you sit there being with the pre-clear. These basics are particularly important when running int because it's so highly charged. You don't want to say or do anything distracting. The pre-clear is in enough discomfort as it is. You want to make this as smooth as possible. Easiest thing in the world, simplest thing in the world. You don't sit there going, well, it sounds from their answer like they're giving me an out instead of an in, or they already gave that answer, or I'm not sure this is running. You do not impose thoughts into the space. It's a shared theta space, and just by having those thoughts, you are going out of present time and out of shared presence with the pre-clear. You really don't need to do this, and that's what you'll discover if you just do it. Greatest thing in the world. Couldn't be simpler. I mean, I know in Scientology you've got to be trained through multi-levels, grad 5 to do this. I feel I could teach any halfway competent person to run this. You could do it. You could definitely do it. Forget all the altitude and mystery that's been assigned things like this. It is not true that because something produces a huge effect that equals it's very difficult to accomplish. Not true at all. So anyway, this is what you do. Tell me a condition encountered of whatever the in or out is. How has that been handled? Or how is that handled? Tell me a condition encountered of, and now the opposite to the in or the out. And how is that handled?